The crystal chandeliers of the peak shivered as the elevator doors slid open on the 80th floor, revealing a panoramic view of Tokyo that looked more like a digital circuit board than a city. This was the $90,000 legacy gala I had meticulously engineered over the last 6 months, a celebration of the Caldwell family's perceived dominance. As I approached the head table, a space where Tokyo's power players were already settling into their velvet seats, I stopped. There were 12 chairs. I was the 13th guest. My husband, Justin, looked up from his champagne, his arm draped casually over the back of the chair where Madison, his very pregnant, very public family friend, was already seated. He didn't stand. He didn't offer an apology. He just let out a sharp, practiced chuckle that cut through the polite dinner music. "Oops," he said, his voice carrying just enough to ensure the surrounding socialites heard his dismissal. "Guess we miscounted. I suppose we're a bit short on space at the adults' table tonight. Don't worry, Taylor. I'm sure there's a stool in the kitchen where the help eats." Patricia, my mother-in-law, didn't even look up as she adjusted her diamond necklace. She simply nodded toward the exit with a smug, cold satisfaction. The earthquake I expected to feel in my chest didn't happen. Instead, a clinical, icy clarity settled over me. I didn't argue. I didn't beg for a seat at a table that was built with my own money. "Seems I'm not family," I said, my voice as steady as a surgeon's hand. "So I shouldn't be responsible for family celebrations." I turned and walked out. Have you ever been treated like a stranger by the very people you helped build up? Let me know your story down in the comments. I'd love to know where you're watching from today. The hum of the elevator descending from the 80th floor felt like a system reboot. As I watched the floor numbers flicker, I didn't see the flashing lights of Tokyo. I saw the columns of a ledger I had been balancing in the dark for 5 long years. Justin and Patricia looked at me and saw an accessory, a convenient tool to manage their social calendar and polish their fading reputation. They never bothered to look beneath the surface to see the corporate strategist who was actually holding their crumbling world together. I had been the silent investor in their version of family, a role I played with a patience that I now realize was a cage of my own making. When I first stepped into the Caldwell circle, I was the industry wizard, the one who could turn a failing acquisition into a success story. I put myself through business school and built my own firm from nothing. Yet to the Caldwells, my professional brilliance was just a charming hobby they could exploit. I kept my mouth shut as Justin's tech empire began to bleed money. I watched from the shadows as his poorly managed investments spiraled toward zero. I remained focused when I realized he was dipping into our joint accounts to fund his ego projects. Instead, I acted. I was the one who personally funded $900,000 in property taxes to prevent their legacy estate from being auctioned off on the courthouse steps. I treated their survival as a strategic mission, a problem to be solved with my own capital and my own sweat. For years, I believed that if I made myself indispensable, I would finally be accepted. It was a house of cards built on the illusion that loyalty could be earned through sacrifice. I had wrapped myself in a glass cage, visible but never truly heard, functioning at the highest level while remaining entirely ignored. I was a survivor of their elitism, convincing myself that my silence was a strategy rather than a slow erosion of my own worth. They called me self-sufficient and independent, using those words as a shield to justify their neglect. I was self-sufficient because I had to be. I was independent because they never gave me a reason to lean on them. While Justin was redeveloping his connections with Madison, I was redeveloping their entire offshore asset structure to keep the authorities from knocking on their door. My compassion had been a luxury they had overdrafted for far too long. I realized then that my marriage wasn't a partnership, it was a subscription service with me footing the entire bill. They hadn't miscounted the chairs tonight. They had simply decided that the architect was no longer needed once the roof was over their heads. But they forgot one fundamental rule of structural integrity. When you remove the foundation, the whole building comes down. I stepped out of the skyscraper and into the neon-soaked streets of Shinjuku. The cool Tokyo air didn't make me shiver. It cleared the remaining fog from my mind. I walked past the crowds, finding a quiet, high-end lounge that smelled of expensive cedar and silence. Tears were just inefficient data points. I didn't let them fall. I needed my laptop. This wasn't a breakdown, it was an audit. I opened the management portal I'd used to build the Caldwell's public image and began the process. I had exactly 30 minutes before the first course at the Peak was over, and the staff began looking for the next round of payments. First, I targeted the venue. The $90,000 deposit for tonight's gala was secured under my corporate credit line, not Justin's. With 3 precise clicks, I initiated a total payment reversal, citing a breach of contract by the primary beneficiaries. Next, I revoked every corporate guarantee I had signed for the rest of their legacy week. The private tour for tomorrow morning? Cancelled. The yacht chartered for the weekend in the bay? Revoked. But the real strike was the legacy fund itself. Justin had spent the evening bragging about a $900,000 endowment, but he neglected to mention that the fund only existed because of my secret personal investments. He thought he had inherited a fortune. In reality, he had been living on a loan I never intended to make permanent. I authorized the immediate liquidation of those assets, transferring every cent back to my private business account. Inside the lounge, my screen glowed with a different kind of sunrise, the kind made of facts, numbers, and quiet retribution. I had been the silent architect of their survival for 5 years, but tonight I was the one who pulled the plug. My phone began to vibrate on the table, a frantic, rhythmic dance. Justin's name flashed across the screen, once, twice, 3 times. Then a text from Patricia. "Taylor, the manager is here. There's a problem with the card. Fix this now. You're embarrassing us." I didn't answer a single one. I simply closed my laptop and ordered a second espresso. The Caldwells wanted to play a game where I didn't have a seat at the table. They were about to find out that when I leave the room, the table disappears along with me. The silence of the lounge was a stark contrast to the digital storm erupting on my phone screen. I watched with clinical detachment as the Caldwells transitioned from confusion to a full-scale toxic smear campaign. Instead of an apology or a moment of self-reflection, my husband and mother-in-law chose to double down on the very arrogance that had brought them to this cliff. The group text, the same one that had been used to plan family excursions without me, now hummed with venom. "You've officially lost your mind." A message from Justin Reed. "Cancelled the venue? In front of everyone? You're acting like a vindictive child over a miscounted chair." Patricia followed up with a message that oozed a different kind of poison. "We gave you every opportunity to be part of this family. And this is how you repay us? You are selfish, ungrateful, and clearly unstable. Don't bother coming back to the suite." I didn't flinch. Their words weren't loud this time. They were just hollow. They weren't shocked by what they'd done. They were only shocked that I had stopped playing along. They actually believed they were entitled to my resources even as they spat on my dignity. I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon even a flicker of regret. But there was only a cold, hard clarity. This wasn't a family drama anymore. It was a forensic accounting process. If they wanted to make it about my character, I would make it about their debt. I opened a new email and contacted a former mentor, one of the most ruthless corporate attorneys in the city. I didn't ask for advice. I gave a set of instructions. We were moving from emotional retaliation to systematic warfare. "I need a formal notice of debt repayment drafted by tomorrow morning," I told him over a brief, professional call. "The Caldwell Legacy Fund is a $900,000 loan, not a gift. And since the borrower has breached the unspoken terms of our agreement, I'm calling it in." I watched the typing bubbles on the family group chat appear and disappear, a frantic signal of people who knew they were losing control. For 5 years, I had been the one to bend, to fix, and to stay silent. But tonight, I had stopped bending. The Caldwells had built their world on appearances, but they had forgotten that a facade doesn't hold up when the foundation decides to walk away. A week after I left that table in Tokyo, the clinical reality of the Caldwells' desperation was laid bare in a sterile conference room. I had initiated a full legal audit of the empire's dwindling assets, and the findings were more devastating than I had imagined. My attorney leaned forward, sliding a folder across the mahogany table with an expression that was part pity, part professional triumph. "They didn't just spend the money, Taylor," he said quietly. "They stole it." Inside the folder were withdrawal slips from my private business account, totaling $120,000. The signature at the bottom looked exactly like mine, the same fluid loops and sharp exits, but a forensic expert had already flagged it as a forgery. Justin and Patricia had spent years playing the role of the refined elite, but when the bank accounts ran dry, they had resorted to simple, clumsy theft. The money hadn't gone toward corporate restructuring or debt relief. It had gone toward Madison's luxury maternity suite, a new private membership for Justin, and a vintage jewelry piece for Patricia. They had been funding their legacy with the proceeds of my sweat, while treating me like a distraction from their sophisticated lives. I sat in the silence, realizing that their power had never been real. It was a borrowed status, a performance leased with stolen currency. Patricia had spent her life obsessing over lineage and commonness, yet she was the one who had committed the most common of crimes. They had confused having wealth with being worthy, and now that the money was gone, they had no inner character to stand on. This was the final strike. It removed every remaining path to redemption or reconciliation. They weren't just an ungrateful family, they were criminals masquerading as aristocracy. The old money facade had finally crumbled, revealing the empty, bankrupt reality beneath. The Tokyo rainy season had finally arrived, a relentless gray curtain that matched the heavy finality of the week. I was sitting in my new apartment, a space half the size of the Caldwell brownstone, but paid for entirely with my own clean revenue when the intercom buzzed. Through the grainy security monitor, I saw him. Justin stood on the sidewalk, his expensive Italian suit soaked through, his shoulders slumped as if the weight of his own lies had finally broken his spine. He looked haggard, the polished veneer of a tech CEO replaced by the raw desperation of a man who had lost his anchor. I opened the door but left the security chain engaged, a metal barrier between my new life and his old deceits. "Taylor, please," he whispered, his voice cracking as the neon lights of Ginza reflected in the puddles at his feet. "The legal audit. The forgery charges. You have to drop them. Mother is having a breakdown, and the authorities are breathing down our necks. We're losing the Ginza offices. Everything we built is going under." I looked at the man who had laughed while I stood seatless in front of Tokyo's elite. I thought about the signature he had forged to pay for his mistress's comfort while he planned to discard me. "What you built was a performance, Justin," I said, my voice as cold and rhythmic as the rain. "I was the only thing real in your entire empire." He reached out a hand, pressing it against the doorframe. "We're family, Taylor. You can't do this to us." "You made your choice the night you miscounted the chairs," I replied. I reached for the folder sitting on my entryway table and slid a document through the gap in the door, the final eviction notice for their prestigious Ginza headquarters, signed by the real owner of the commercial lease. "I didn't destroy your legacy, Justin. I just stopped funding it. Please," he begged, his eyes red and searching. "Help us one last time." I leaned in close to the gap, meeting his gaze with a terrifying clarity. "Seems I'm not family," I whispered, echoing the words he had used to humiliate me. "So I'm not responsible for your survival." I closed the door and turned the deadbolt. The sound of the lock engaging was the most satisfying thing I had heard in 5 years. I didn't wait to hear him leave. I walked to my kitchen, poured a glass of wine, and watched the rain wash the city clean. 6 months later, the relentless gray of Tokyo was a distant memory as I stood on a terrace overlooking the Amalfi Coast, watching the sun dip into the Mediterranean. The air didn't smell of corporate anxiety anymore. It smelled of salt and a future I had designed for myself. My new firm, Horizon Sustainable Development, was thriving, but the real success wasn't in the profit margins. It was in the freedom to never let myself be hidden again. The Caldwell empire had been systematically dismantled. The Ginza offices were sold to a rival, and the family name was no longer a golden ticket but a warning label. Justin had received a suspended sentence for his involvement in the financial fraud, and Patricia was living in a modest apartment, far from the social circles she once used to diminish me. They had built their lives on a foundation of conditional love, and when they withdrew their loyalty, they found they had nothing left to stand on. I realized that the greatest revenge wasn't breaking them. It was becoming the person they said I could never be without their permission. I had turned their rejection into a message for others. I now spend my weekends mentoring young women in finance, teaching them how to build their own tables so they never have to beg for a chair. If you've ever felt like the extra person in the room, or the one whose contributions are treated as footnotes, this is my letter to you. You are not defined by the seat you are given. You are defined by the world you create when you decide to walk away. Don't wait for them to notice you. Make your own noise. The greatest revenge is living well, with a clear conscience and a horizon that is entirely your own. If Taylor's journey from the invisible help to the architect of her own life inspired you, please share this video with one friend who needs to hear it. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories of resilience and quiet retribution.